All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first session of ARI's Tuesday Night Education series. Really excited to have you all here. My name's Emma Walker, and I'm the Education Director for ARI. That's the American Institute for Avalanche Research and Education. We're a nonprofit organization based in Colorado in Crested Butte. And we have a staff of 10 people spread actually across the country, but we do curriculum for recreational avalanche education, and then we also deliver pro and instructor training courses. And then we also do things like this, where we get to have the public come together to learn about some frequently asked questions that we and our instructors get. So really excited to have you all here. This is a topic I'm really excited about because it's a question that comes up a lot on our recreational courses. So really excited to have a chance to have an expert answer some of those questions. With us tonight is Brian Lazar. He's the Deputy Director of the Colorado Avalanche Information Center. And Brian also has some ARI connections, so he's also an educator in his roots. Brian's based in Carbondale, and I'm really excited to have him here to answer some of these questions about how to interpret a moderate to considerable avalanche forecast. So we're going to take about an hour to get through Brian's presentation, and then we'll answer some questions. And you're welcome to drop questions into the chat or the Q&A anytime. We'll get to them just as soon as there's either a break in Brian's presentation or at the end, whichever makes more sense. With that, Brian, I'm going to mute and you can go ahead and take it away.
Great, thanks, Emma. Fear not, I do not have an hour-long presentation with slides. I'm not going to kill you that way. But I do want to lay the groundwork and then at least leave a handsome amount of time to discuss this stuff, because I assume there's probably going to be a lot of questions. So I wanted to leave more time for that. But I will start with a little slide deck just to lay the groundwork. And Emma, does that look right? Can you see the slide deck and not the presenter view?
Yep, that's right.
Great. Okay, so I just want to walk through some basic kind of behind the scenes, under the hood, so to speak, concepts that avalanche forecasters will use when they're trying to assign an avalanche danger rating. And since this was codified in 2017 through a paper that Grant Statham was the lead author on, he produced the conceptual model of avalanche hazard, which was essentially a guidance document that tried to get down on paper, the forecasting process, put some common terminology, some common language around all of the questions that we wrestle with in avalanche forecasting, whether that's on an operational scale for like a mine or a heli ski operation, or for public avalanche forecasting, which will be what we talk about today. But this graphic really does capture all of the contents of this conceptual model, and I want to lay out how we use this conceptual model to arrive at an avalanche danger rating and what we were using kind of before that. And so the whole process is based on this idea of evaluation of the strength or the class of the data, and then the weight of the data, which is its volume, relevance, and reliability. And that's crucial to any hazard evaluation process, including avalanches. And so a brief history on the North American Public Avalanche Danger Scale. It was first proffered in 1993 when we introduced this 5-level ordinal scale, and it was originally developed in Europe as a way of communicating avalanche hazard. So it's not as old as you might think. This didn't come around until 1993. In 1994, those of us in North America slightly modified what the Europeans were doing and introduced it in North America with slightly different danger level descriptors in each country, meaning between Canada and the United States. And then New Zealand quickly adopted it as well. In 2005, we began work as a community on a consistent North American avalanche danger scale. So trying to bring essentially the Canadians and the Americans onto the same page. So at least in North America, we'd be singing off the same sheet of music. And then in 2010, this revised North American avalanche danger scale was produced with an accompanying conceptual model. So and originally this was came out of a different group called ADFAR, but these were the initial seeds that ultimately led to the conceptual model of avalanche hazard. And Grant Statham was part of that ADFAR model, which came out of Canada. And that was first started to get tossed around in 2008 and published in 2010. And again, then 7 years later, it did become the conceptual model of avalanche hazard. So we've been using this current version. The graphics have changed a little bit in the last couple years, but this version of the North American Public Avalanche Danger Scale is the one we have been using since 2010. So we're going on its 15th year in of use. And so what we had essentially prior to the conceptual model of avalanche hazard, the only guidance we had as forecasters for applying and assigning danger ratings was the content of the danger scale itself. And so you can see that there are three principal columns: the travel advice, the likelihood, the size, and the distribution. And I know Emma had asked me to kind of talk about the likelihood thing, but when we're the likelihood piece of this puzzle, but when we're talking about assigning an avalanche danger rating, it's really hard to pull likelihood out of the size and distribution. And I want to talk about how that relates to the travel advice. And in many cases, when we're presenting this to the public at large, we only include the travel advice because that is at the end of the day, the most important piece. Since then, we've added additional guidance, which started with the conceptual model of avalanche hazard. The CAIC started using in around 2015 additional internal guidance for assigning avalanche danger ratings and avalanche problems and the like. We worked with the National Avalanche Center, which adopted some of that initial guidance. And then since then, it's been a collaborative effort to refine and improve the internal guidance, which is in addition to what you see here. So I will focus on the likelihood part of the conceptual model here. And you can see here, when we end up assigning a likelihood, we are essentially ending up in a box that's in this matrix on the right-hand side. And you can see the terms, range from unlikely to possible to very likely, almost certain. And how we get there is by assigning a spatial distribution. That's table 6 down here on the bottom, where we are looking at whether the spatial distribution of a particular avalanche problem, a persistent slab, a wind slab, whatever it may be, how is it in the terrain? And we've got a few terms here that we decide on as a forecasting team. Is the problem isolated, which means the avalanche problem is spotty and only found in a few terrain features? Evidence is rare and hard to find. Is it in specific terrain features, which colloquially means can I describe essentially the terrain features that this is in, or is it widespread? Is it found everywhere? And then on the x-axis is the sensitivity to triggers. And again, we've got these qualitative terms from unreactive to touchy. And you can see here, when we're looking at the sensitivity, each of these terms has what we expect in terms of natural releases, what we expect in terms of human triggers, the size of explosive trigger size, the results, and then Cornish triggers. And so this allows us to pick both a sensitivity term and a spatial distribution term, and then we end up somewhere in this matrix. And this is where the likelihood part of the avalanche hazard piece comes from. So the likelihood is a description of the chance of encountering a particular avalanche problem. It comes from that spatial distribution and sensitivity. So the spatial distribution dictates how likely you are to encounter the problem in the highlighted avalanche terrain, which is important. And the sensitivity indicates that if you go into that terrain, how easy is it for you to trigger that avalanche? And so it's important to distinguish between probability and likelihood. So remember, we are talking about likelihood terms here. So again, that's the y-axis that ultimately gives us the avalanche hazard, which is the danger rating. But that's different than probability. So probability represents some kind of numerical value. So it often represents some kind of mathematical expression like 50% chance. But these are quantifiable values, and importantly, they are quantitative, which means that we assign numbers. So possible may, in some contexts, like if you look at the IPCC, when they're talking about likely outcomes of potential concentration pathways for climate change, for example, may define possible as between a 10 and 40% chance of occurring. That is not what we're talking about here in avalanche danger. We are using qualitative terms, which is likelihood. So the chance of an avalanche releasing in a specific location during the forecast period regardless of the size. So the likelihood is completely independent of the size. It's just how easy is it for avalanches to either release naturally or be human triggered. And so while probability in this top term is very much dependent on scale, in practice, forecasters express likelihood judgments independent of scale. So it's not dependent on the size. And we use those qualitative terms, which come directly out of the conceptual model of avalanche hazard. But we can't get to an avalanche danger rating until we consider the destructive size. So it's the likelihood consequence model. So the likelihood, destructive size is the consequence. This is often the scale you will see. This is how we think about this in terms of forecasters. Small avalanches are generally harmless to people. These are the D1s. Large avalanches, we call them large, even though we may not think of them as large, because once we get to D2 size avalanches, they are big enough to very injure or kill a person. So when your element at risk is a person outside of a vehicle, large avalanches are big enough to kill you. Now, if you were working in a different context and you were driving, giant mining trucks, D2 avalanches would be relatively harmless and you would be using a different kind of destructive scale. But when we're talking about people moving around in the environment, they're much more vulnerable than someone driving a giant truck or piece of machinery. And so for us, D2 avalanches are considered large. Very large are D3s, and then historic get grouped together D4s and D5s because we're dealing with really big avalanche cycles, often accompanying with either high and or extreme danger. And so this is the destructive scale, which comes out of snow, weather, and avalanche guidelines, or our often cited SWAG guidelines. Sometimes this is a little bit harder for people to kind of wrap their heads around. There are volumes associated with this, but again, sometimes those are a little nebulous, not often intuitive. And so Jameson did some work in 2020 where he tried to put a scale together that was maybe a little bit more relatable for people, not just for the public, but for forecasters when we're starting to think about this. And notably, what came out of Jameson's work on this kind of stuff, of course, being from Canada, he relies on hockey rinks, you can see, to talk about typical deposit volume. But it does help us as forecasters kind of calibrate against the SWAG definition so that we know which sizes that we're talking about. And across the board, when Jameson came and spoke to us at our snow and avalanche workshop several years back, he had many professionals kind of look at a ton of photos and estimate their sizes. And by and large, either forecasters or avalanche professionals were getting the size about right, or more often than not, underestimating the size, rarely, if ever, overestimating the size. So when you're looking at avalanches from a distance or from a photo, it's quite easy to underestimate how destructive they are. So sometimes thinking about how deep the snow would be if you filled it up into a hockey rink is helpful. So it's important to realize that we do have 5 danger scales, but there's a large range within each level. And so this is one of the challenges that we are presented with as forecasters, is that we're presented with a tool that allows us to communicate avalanche hazard to the public in a stepwise fashion. But this graph, which comes out of the Swiss group, SLF, is conceptual, but it does really kind of paint the picture that, the low end of moderate, for example, is quite different than the high end. And so you're in a much more dangerous place if you're just on the low end of the considerable moderate line. And again, those ranges almost get bigger as you go up the scale. So a big range in avalanche conditions between considerable. And we as forecasters will often talk about where we lie on this spectrum. Are we in considerable danger, but much closer to low? Much closer to moderate, or much closer to high, or in the middle of the range, because it does matter for our public messaging. And the other important thing is, when we're considering avalanche danger, is that we list avalanche problem types, but the danger, because you can not often separate the treatment for these different avalanche problems in the field, the avalanche danger is a result of your cumulative exposure to all avalanche problems that are existing right now. And so when we fill in an avalanche rows and shade certain aspects and elevations, this is where you are most likely to find that avalanche problem. So in this example, we have a persistent slab avalanche problem on northerly and easterly facing slopes at all elevations. And so when I talk about the likelihood of either natural or human triggered avalanches. And this is important because we cannot communicate this through the avalanche problem type graphics, but we have to consider the likelihood of both natural and human triggered. And of course, human triggered are often more likely because of just the nature of the problem. But when we assign a qualitative likelihood term like possible, the possible rating applies to the shaded areas. And so your avalanche rows will show you where in the terrain you are most likely to encounter the problem. Contrary to some beliefs, this does not suggest that the problem is impossible to find or non-existent on the non-shaded slopes. It simply means those are much less likely to harbor that particular avalanche problem. So the possible likelihood and the very large size applies to the shaded areas of the rows. And so the danger is a function of both the probability, the likelihood, and the consequences, the destructive side. If we lay avalanche problem types on top of this, we can often put this into a reasonable layout. This is just a conceptual diagram, but usually we've got increasing hazard as the destructive size gets bigger and the likelihood of triggering gets bigger. Very intuitive. And you can see where these avalanche problem types would typically fall within such a construct. So if we tie the elements from the avalanche problem type back to the conceptual model, you can see the avalanche problem types, which were not designed as a public communication tool. These were designed as risk treatment categories, which really came out of an operational context, which was heli ski operations. And this was the early work of Roger Atkins. But we have used this tool and modified it somewhat to try to communicate avalanche problem types and the components of the conceptual model to the public. It comes with some baggage because this whole conceptual model and design was internal guidance for avalanche forecasters to talk about what kinds of avalanches we might encounter in the field and therefore develop risk treatments depending on our operational context and elements at risk. We are using that tool to try and communicate risk of avalanches to the public. And because this tool was not designed from the ground up to communicate public safety messages, there's some pitfalls there, and this may be ripe for some revision here in the near future. You can see the type of avalanche problem is just our avalanche problem type. The location is indicated by the spatial distribution rows. Likelihood and destructive size are on simple slider bars or some kind of scale or dial. And so this avalanche hazard is the consideration between the likelihood and size of some types of avalanche problems. And so this is where the likelihood terms come from. And then you can see when we try to assign a danger rating, we've got likelihood terms and size and distribution lumped together into this final column. And so when we look at the two categories where most avalanche accidents happen, which is considerable and moderate, I want to focus on the terms that are contained within the likelihood and the size and distribution columns. But I want to point out that at the end of the day, whenever we try to put Mother Nature into boxes, it's inevitable that there's going to be situations and cases where this does not work out well. Mother Nature does not like to be put in boxes, but for our processes, procedures, consistency, it's very helpful for us to try and bin things so we can help communicate, but it doesn't always work out great. So at the end of the day, we as forecasters will fall back on travel advice. And if things aren't always lining up nicely, we ask ourselves, well, what's the travel advice that we need to communicate to people today? And so it's important that the likelihood and problem are scale dependent. So just as an example, and this comes out of some recent work from Scott Tomert that he presented at just the most recent ISSW in Norway this past fall, but this is just a thought exercise to think about. So imagine a persistent slab problem is likely. And so in this case, let's just say likely is better than a half and half chance. So let's call it a 60% chance. So for a single start zone, you may have a 60% chance of releasing it during your forecast time period. But for a forecast region, all the start zones where we have a 60% chance, all the start zones where we have a 60% chance of releasing. So therefore, the forecaster is expecting to see out of 10 specific start zones. If I've highlighted near tree line on north-facing slopes, I'd expect 6 out of those 10 start zones to release. Okay. So the point of this example is not how we're using the scale now, but that the likelihood and problem are scale dependent. And so if we look at just moderate danger, so again, travel advice is heightened avalanches on specific terrain features. And for forecasters, that means can I describe those terrain features? Just saying specific terrain features, of course, is not actionable. So we need to describe where those are. Something like wind-loaded slopes below ridge lines on north and northeast facing slopes, something along those lines. Or, thin rocky areas where you can see, sculpted lenses of wind-drifted snow with lots of shallow spots. Things that we can describe to people that they can use to act. And so here we're recommending evaluate snow and terrain carefully and identify those features of concern, which must be described in the avalanche forecast. So the distribution in this case is specific, right? As it's as that word appears in the travel advice. And so specific, to go back to the conceptual model, means the avalanche problem exists in terrain features with common characteristics that we can articulate and describe to the public so that they can identify those things in the field. The likelihood, as you notice now, is broken into 2 categories because there are naturals and then there are human triggered avalanches. So for moderate avalanche danger, we do not expect natural avalanche activity. It would be highly unlikely for us to see natural avalanches in moderate danger. There are some exceptions, like we might expect small, loose, wet avalanches if we got a nice cold spring storm, and then the sun pops out and you just expect a small shed cycle that could fit under moderate danger, even though it does not fit the likelihood criteria of moderate, because our last criteria is size. And so if we expect most avalanches to be small, then we still might land on the conclusion that moderate travel advice is what fits. If we look at considerable danger, for example, now the problem is fairly widespread. So again, the travel advice: dangerous avalanche conditions, careful snowpack evaluation, cautious route finding, conservative decision-making is essential. So that while you might not see the word widespread appear in the travel advice, this is what we're thinking about as avalanche forecasters: dangerous avalanche conditions on more than just specific terrain features. So which means the avalanche problem can be found in many location and terrain features. Notice naturals are now possible. So again, what do we mean by possible? And we at the CAIC have used numeric metrics, which we've adopted from the IPCC, to try and assign quantitative values with that with varying degrees of success. We don't do that as much anymore, and we just simply rely on the conceptual model to land on that qualitative term. So natural avalanches are possible, but we don't expect lots of them. It's just that they're, possible. You might have a 10 to 50% chance, let's say, of seeing natural avalanches. Where human triggered avalanches are likely if you go into the terrain features that we are cautioning you about. So if you go into those steep, wind-loaded, northeast facing slopes near and above tree line that we're painting the avalanche problem on, in considerable danger, we think you're more likely than not to trigger those slopes. The odds are not stacked up in your favor. Where in moderate, it's possible. The odds are maybe in your favor, but again, the consequences of being wrong could be quite large. And so the size of the avalanches is, we expect mostly small avalanches, less than D2s in many areas. We expect large avalanches on the specific terrain features we're warning you about, and very large avalanches or D3s in isolated terrain features. So again, if we go back to moderate, the only D2 avalanches we expect are in isolated terrain features, different than specific, okay? And when things don't line up into a single row, we defer to the travel advice, like I mentioned earlier. So we will put out the danger rating, even if the boxes don't line up exactly, to communicate the travel advice that we think will best keep people safe during that day. And then we have some additional guidance for when things get a little bit tricky. So these are common enough scenarios that we have codified guidance both at the CAIC and at the National Avalanche Center that are very similar to account for these kind of tricky forecasting situations. And here's one of them. So we expect most avalanches to be large. So I'm sorry, let me start with the likelihood terms. So if we expect that natural avalanches are unlikely, that fits in a moderate, but human triggered are likely. And this is a very common scenario and setup when we're dealing with persistent slab avalanches. The natural cycle is long gone, but we've got a really crappy snowpack structure with reactive weak layers. So we expect nothing really to run all by itself, but if you go and test slopes, you are likely to trigger avalanches. So natural unlikely, human triggered likely. So where do we rate that? Do we rate that considerable? Do we rate that moderate? Our consideration in these tricky forecast scenarios is to consider size as an additional criteria to help us figure out which danger rating we should assign. So if we expect most avalanches are going to be big enough to kill somebody or bury them or injure them, we go with considerable. If we expect most of the avalanches to be small, we will go with moderate. And then the last tool is we've got text, our bottom line, our summary, or discussion to highlight that natural avalanches are unlikely while human triggered are likely. And that the size is what's driving the consequences piece of this puzzle is what's driving the assignment of the danger rating. And so here is, again, some work from Tolmert, and I'm just putting this out there as food for thought. This has not been adopted, but Scott and his colleagues kind of put this out there as a way to help us get a little bit more consistent because there is a wide, when he did a survey some years ago asking forecasters, avalanche professionals to assign numerical probabilities to the qualitative likelihood terms like possible or likely, there was quite a spread. It varied by forecaster, varied by avalanche professional, and it did vary to some degree by region. And so Scott has put out for the community to consider this idea of trying to get a little bit better consistency by assigning these probability terms with numerical probabilities and assigning frequency distribution, which are independent of scale. And I think there's some promise to this type of approach, but this has not been codified and it is not in use yet. This is something that is being considered. And so here is Scott's proposed revision to what that matrix might look like in an updated conceptual model for avalanche hazard spatial distribution sensitivity triggers thing. So you can see he's got few different categories. He's got highly unlikely, unlikely, fair chance, which is what we would call possible. So look at the range in that, 5 to 50%. Likely is over that 50% threshold, very likely greater than 3/4% chance. And there is no almost certain. But I think there is some merit to at least going through this as a thought exercise. These kinds of things usually take quite a bit of arguing and discussion, but ultimately we will probably make some improvement along these lines. I'm going to skip that one. And I think that's all I've got, but I know that went by fast, which is why I wanted to leave kind of the second half of tonight to have a discussion and answer any questions that people have got.
Thanks, Brian. That's great.
Yeah.
A lot of really good information. And I think folks here, if you've taken an ARI 1, you have a little bit of experience looking at and interpreting a forecast and doing some trip planning. Brian, can you talk a little bit off the cuff about, if you, given all this information you've given us, if I'm looking at the forecast for the zone that I would like to travel in, what am I looking at? If I see a considerable forecast for the area that I'm planning to travel tomorrow, I know obviously the short answer to that is it depends, but what are some of the things that you might do or that you might consider if you see that considerable forecast for an area that you'd want to travel?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the first thing to do is when they're talking about considerable avalanche danger, the question I would ask myself is essentially, well, what's driving that danger? So essentially, how widespread, which avalanche problem are they talking about? Because at the end of the day, the avalanche problem type are essentially nothing more than risk management categories. And so when we talk about storm snow instabilities, for example, storm and wind slabs, these are avalanches that break on non-persistent weak layers, and so therefore they break in really predictable ways. And you're not going to have to be dealing with things like remote triggering avalanches from below. So the way I move around the terrain is greatly impacted by the kind of avalanche I expect to encounter. And the thing is, like, as avalanche professionals, we have a lot more confidence at the end of the day in the kind of avalanche we're likely to encounter than in the probability of doing so. And so I really focus on the avalanche problem type because that is often the assignment the forecasters have the most confidence in. And so if I'm dealing with considerable avalanche danger, first I want to know what avalanche problem type am I dealing with. If it is a persistent type of problem, I have to be worrying about remote triggers. I have to be worrying about overhead hazard, which means I have to move around the terrain with much larger buffers around avalanche terrain. And then and then I would start to look at the size, because once you start hitting considerable avalanche danger, natural avalanche activity is on the radar. And so I have to be much more cognizant of overhead hazard. And so that even though I'm moving through flat terrain, if I'm moving underneath features that are highlighted in the problem distribution rows, I have to be very cognizant of how close I'm getting to potential start zones and run ups. Because if I'm dealing with possible D3 avalanches, I need huge buffers around the bottom of start zones. Where if I'm in moderate danger, for example, and even if it's a persistent problem, I don't expect natural avalanche triggers, and I can hug, the bottom of runouts much more closely, for example.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That's really helpful. I think, yeah, I think it's really basically what you're saying. It sounds like, if I can interpret for folks too, is also it's not just the danger rating that we're looking at. It also matters a lot what the avalanche problem in the forecast is. So,
Yeah, I mean, and so we, present, essentially the way we present public safety information from an avalanche forecasting perspective is in tiers of information. And so the top tier is just the overall danger rating. So not by elevation band, not by compass direction. Are you in moderate, considerable high avalanche danger? That would be the highest danger rating that you would find anywhere in your elevation band or on your avalanche danger rows, if you're in an area where they're using that. And so that is just really the beginning of the puzzle. And so, for people that have taken even an ARI, 1 class, for example, they're fully equipped to dig beyond the tier 1 danger rating. And so when you get into kind of tier 1.5, that includes avalanche danger by, let's say, elevation band for most places. So it's not as simple as 1 danger rating, but danger rating does vary depending on elevation, for example. And then so you can get a tier 1.5 information along with a summary, and then you start getting into kind of tier 2 information, which would include your avalanche problems. What kind of avalanche do I expect to encounter? Where in the terrain am I most likely to encounter it? And if I do, what are my probability and consequences of triggering an avalanche? So, what's the likelihood? What's the destructive size? So you can dig down to that level. And then I always encourage people to read the forecast discussion, because at the end of the day, this is where forecasters have the most room to breathe and tell you why they've put out the forecast that they have. So it's really important. I would read the discussions, more than anything, particularly in between outings. If you went out last weekend, you're in the office all week, and you're not getting out till next weekend, I would be reading the forecast discussions.
awesome. Thanks, Brian. We have a couple of questions in the chat, so I'll just
Sure.
start sending those your way, and I'm gonna screen share for this first one while you talk a little bit. So the first question we have in the chat is, or in the Q&A is, are forecasting methods, terminology, that sort of thing, are those things consistent across various avalanche centers? Can you talk a little bit about that while I bring up avalanche.org, Brian?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Yes, like way more than they used to be. Let's put it that way. So, before we had the conceptual model of avalanche hazard as a guidance document, the way we approach these things and the way we addressed them varied a lot, by forecast center, and sometimes even within forecast centers. We have not completely solved that problem, but since the last 8 years since the conceptual model has been out and in use, the newer generation is being trained on using that. They're being introduced to the conceptual model of avalanche hazard, or at least the concepts and the language within, at their very earliest avalanche courses. And so the way we discuss things as avalanche professionals has gotten much more consistent. When I say an avalanche problem is stubborn and isolated, people in any other forecast center at least know what I'm talking about, even if we don't all use it exactly the same way. And part of how we can get a little bit better in consistency is through more interagency training. So right now there are still some differences between forecast centers just based on local interpretations of the conceptual model of avalanche hazard, the guidance tools for applying the danger scale, and that we don't have tons of interagency training, but it's getting way better. And the good news is it's better than it ever has been in terms of consistency, and we continue to make improvements every year.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And while you were answering that question, I also brought up avalanche.org, which for folks tuning in, this is a great resource that one just gives you kind of a dashboard of these are all of the avalanche forecasts for the day that have been issued so far. So not only can you find your local forecast here, but there's also here at the top in these tabs, there is also an encyclopedia here. And so some of that terminology that you mentioned, whether that terminology is consistent, not everything that you'll see mentioned in a forecast is necessarily in the encyclopedia. Some of the really technical terms, those are found in what we call SWAG, Snow, Weather, and Avalanche Guidelines. That's kind of the dictionary for snow and avalanche professionals that defines all of those terms. But anything you'd see in a recreational forecast or for your purposes recreating in the backcountry, you'll probably be able to find most of those definitions here on avalanche.org under education and encyclopedia. All right, I'll go ahead and stop sharing. I'm just going to keep going with the questions if that's all right, Brian.
Yeah.
Someone asks, do moderate and considerable ratings vary greatly between different types of snowpacks, like maritime or intercontinental? What does that look like from snowpack to snowpack?
Well, in theory, no. So in theory, moderate or considerable dangers should be the same, whether you're in a maritime climate or in a continental climate or Arctic maritime or whatever. It shouldn't matter because it's just the likelihood of triggering avalanches and the consequences of doing so. So it shouldn't vary. In practice, there's probably more variation than I think many of us in the community would like to admit, because of what we're comfortable with. And so what I have seen is, and it's getting better because the guidance is very clear. And so if I expect a certain size of avalanches with a certain sensitivity and spatial distribution, any of my colleagues should pick the same danger rating. A study I did in 2016 shows that we've got some work to do, but our guidance documents is helping us get a little bit more onto the same page. And so what I've often seen is that those of us who have spent lots of times on, say, continental snowpacks, who are quite used to seeing persistent weak layers in our snowpack, are more comfortable going with lower danger ratings after a period of no avalanche activity than colleagues that live in maritime snowpacks, where if they see a persistent grain type, it's terrifying to them. And that is a little bit of a cultural difference that we are working to kind of bridge the gap on. But if you grow up in a climate where you never see faceted grains and you get a faceted weak layer, it's very hard to lower the danger because you're terrified of it. And I think people that have lived and breathed persistent weak layers all the time are a little bit have a little bit easier time dropping the avalanche danger, even when you have a seemingly poor snowpack structure.
So it depends. As is so often the answer, it depends. Awesome. Thanks, Brian. All right, we've got somebody wondering about kind of the sort of trigger categories for if we're thinking about likelihood. So this person wonders, would it be helpful to distinguish in likelihood between human and snowmobile because snowmobiles are so much heavier or more likely to trigger avalanches than, say, splitboarders or skiers? Could the danger, probability, and scale levels on a given day be moderate for foot traffic and considerable for snowmobilers? Can you speak a little to that, Brian?
Yeah, I can, and I think it's a really good question. And I foresee a day where we actually have different avalanche forecasts depending on user type. For example, the kinds of avalanches that might be threatening to an ice climber, for example, maybe maybe look much different to the kinds of avalanche that might be threatening to a snowshoer. So, but right now we're dealing with, one scale to communicate to all public avalanche users. And so we do have to bin things. And yeah, snowmobilers are, it's a much bigger weight onto the snowpack. And so, yes, it is easier oftentimes for snowmobiles to trigger avalanches than somebody on foot. But that opens up a can of worms because, like, for example, if you look at swag, like what Emma mentioned, the number of trigger codes we have in there are, a dozen or more. And so we'd have to open this up, like we'd have to start splitting out natural avalanches from, are we talking about wind distribution? Are we talking about rain? Are we talking about wildlife triggering avalanches? And so you can imagine human triggered would have a bunch of different categories as well. So it wouldn't just be snowmobilers versus skiers versus potentially snowmobilers, or someone on foot, for example, who's much more likely to trigger an avalanche than somebody on big fat skis. So it does open a can of worms, but I think the solution to I think a really important question you bring up is that ultimately one day I think we will probably have different avalanche forecasts depending on the use type population we're talking to.
Awesome. Thanks. That was a really good question. Um, all right, we have a couple folks who are wondering a little bit about just what goes into the forecast. So the first of these questions is how many tests, what types of tests, and what results, what all ends up in the forecast on the danger rows for that aspect or area that you're forecasting for?
Yeah, so I mean, it's all of the above, really. I mean, so what we're looking at is, when we think about classes of data, we move and prioritize the data that we get based on how close it is to actually triggering avalanches. So, of course, avalanche activity is going to be, some of the most important data that we get. When you move away from avalanche activity, we start looking at snowpack structure, and of course, snowpack structure would involve snowpack tests. And often we will weight what we're finding in terms of snowpack tests on large column tests like propagation saw tests, extended column tests, because it does give us some information into the propensity of propagation, which we can tie directly to human triggered avalanches. And so that's how we essentially take avalanche activity, we take snowpack structure, which includes the snowpack test results, trends of those two things over time, and then ultimately what the weather is then going to do to those elements. And that's what allows us to kind of paint the avalanche, the distribution rows for every avalanche problem, like where we think you're most likely to find the problem.
Great. And then sort of follow up to that is, um, can you talk a little bit about who determines or how the regions or areas for forecasting are determined? I know it's a little bit different, and maybe you can just give kind of an overview of the dynamic regions in Colorado. The person who wrote in is wondering, they live in the Provo area, and so
Mhm.
it's a bit different there. But maybe you can just talk a little bit about how forecast regions are determined, and then how specifically those dynamic regions look in Colorado.
Yeah, so the model for many, many years, which is still the dominant model in most places, is you define forecast regions which stay fixed throughout the season. So if you're in Provo, you've got your Provo forecast zone, and that doesn't move. Those boundaries stay the same. Then of course you will often have variations within the zone, throughout the zone, and those are things forecasters have to wrestle with, because if you've got one area that's getting much more dangerous, like in the northern part of the Provo zone compared to the south, you have to figure out if that's a large enough area to drive the danger in that whole forecast zone. How those forecast zones get developed varies quite a bit depending on which avalanche forecast center you're going in, but it's almost always some kind of combination of snow climate and then access and use patterns. And that's how most of these historic forecast zones have been drawn. And then they stay fairly static. In the last number of years, the Swiss, the Canadians, and us at the CAIC have moved to what Emma was describing as these dynamic forecast zones. And so essentially, we've broken our mountains up into much, much tinier pieces. Um, so much tinier jigsaw puzzles. So you can imagine like the Provo zone being made of 10 smaller little shapes. And so what we can do then is, based on current conditions, group our forecast zones will change over time. So we don't have static fixed boundaries, but the boundaries will change over time based on snowpack conditions and avalanche situations. And so if the Provo zone, for example, had heightened avalanche conditions in the northern third of it, we would just break that out and issue our own forecast for that northern portion.
Awesome. All right, we're coming at you with a ton of questions about, I think folks are really interested in what goes into making a forecast. So we have a couple more questions kind of on that thread, and I'll just keep
Sure.
going. Um, so let's see. This person is wondering, whether, I guess these are two separate questions, but I'll have you answer them kind of together. This person's wondering if every single one of the forecast areas have tests that are completed by professionals. I realize you can probably only speak to Colorado, but maybe you can talk a little about that. And then kind of related, somebody's wondering what kind of educational backgrounds forecasters have, what education is necessary if you want to become a forecaster, like, is this a full-time career? And I know, again, the answer is it depends, and it does vary widely based on the region that you're in. For example, at CAIC, like, this is Brian's full-time job, but maybe you can talk just a little bit about the forecaster career path, and then a little bit about at CAIC, who's actually performing those tests that go into the forecast.
Yeah. So it's interesting. There's a lot of circuitous paths to becoming essentially an avalanche forecaster. Most of the folks in our crew come from, you need some kind of snow safety background, which mostly people get either through kind of ski patrolling or mountain guiding is, I think, most of it. But that alone really doesn't paint the whole picture, let's say. So most people come from some kind of operational experience, whether it's ski patrolling or ski guiding or guiding in some kind of aspect. And then the education that goes behind that varies greatly. So everyone kind of, goes through their professional avalanche courses, which are in modern terms, the Pro 1s and the Pro 2s. But beyond that, we've got people with, high school education through PhDs. And, people have studied everything from meteorology to snowpack science to mechanics. My graduate work was in engineering and snow and ice mechanics, for example. So it's usually some kind of combination of operational experience and then education that gets you into avalanche forecasting. And I'm sorry, what was the second part of that question?
Whether all of the tests that appear in a forecast, like any test results that are happening, I guess who's writing those forecasts and what kind of are those professionals who are performing those tests? Maybe you can talk a little bit about just like what kinds of professional or non-professional observations might go into a forecast.
Yeah, I mean, so most forecast centers that I'm aware of, maybe all, very much have to rely on crowdsourcing. So, we're probably, I think, by people, the biggest avalanche forecast center in the world at this point, and that's 30 people. We also have to forecast for the highways. That's 30 people to cover the state of Colorado. And that's all of our backcountry and all of our highways. There's just no way to cover it. And there's forecast operations with like 2 or 3 people to cover fairly large swaths of terrain. And so you just have to rely on crowdsourcing. And so that comes with, essentially gathering information from any available professional observations you might get, which would include things like mechanized ski operations, guiding operations, people on the road, highway drivers, plow drivers, and then the public at large. And so, when we put that kind of all into a database, we may weight different observations, like observations from professionals, more heavily. And that's that strength and weight of evidence thing. So we want information from everybody. Like, everyone's got a computer in their pocket now. So photos are great and that's super good information. But if I get a detailed trip report from, seasoned avalanche professionals, I put more weight into that particular observation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. And then this person's wondering, are forecasts written the night before or morning of? Like, how does that work?
Well, it depends on which operation, which forecast center you're dealing with. And so our product schedule, um, along with several others, have moved to PM forecasts. So we put the forecasts out, like our forecasts come out at 4:30 every day, and they follow the next 2 days. So today is Tuesday. Our forecast just went out at 4:30 a couple hours ago, and that's going to cover Wednesday and Thursday. There are still many forecast centers, particularly in the US, that do forecasts the morning of. And so they typically will have those things out by about 7:30 in the morning. So it
Awesome.
depends on what your forecast center is doing.
Okay. And that's something that probably you can find on your forecast center's website, right? If you're probably that's
Yeah, if you
information.
click on any product, it'll say it will give you when the forecast was issued and when it's good for.
Awesome. All right, have so many good questions, and we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but I have two more that I want to ask you, and then For anyone else who has already submitted a question that we haven't gotten to, or if you have more questions, still feel free to drop them in. And we use these to generate the tech tips that go out in our monthly emails. And maybe we can even bring in an Ask a Forecaster, and we could have Brian answer another question or two for us for our next month's newsletter. But I'll ask you these two more questions first. These are both really good questions. This one, I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about maybe some red flags. This person wonders, if you're traveling in or near avalanche terrain with a considerable forecast, what indicators might make you abandon your planned route?
Yeah, well, those are good questions. Um, so the way I'm just speaking for myself personally, but the way I trip plan and the way I approach avalanche terrain is I plan typically the day before, sometimes the morning of, but what we decided is with myself and my partners is one, I make sure that anyone I go out skiing with has a shared level of risk acceptance, a shared mental model that we're both trying to get the same things and we're willing to take similar risks. We agree on what terrain will consider for the day. We then, most importantly, agree on which terrain we are avoiding from the comforts of our own home before we get out there and get influenced by things like beautiful looking powder fields, cold weather, wind, whatever. We're emotional beings and we make mistakes all the time in those situations. And so if we have decided we are not entering a particular piece of terrain when we are doing our trip plan, I will never open that in the field. It's just out for the day. And maybe that's a mistake, and maybe I missed some good skiing along the way, but that's why I'm my age and still doing this. So you have to be able to essentially give up some good turns on occasion. And if you ruled something out, don't change your opinion in the field. That's my approach to kind of doing that stuff. So on a considerable day, I might say, hey, I think we can go ski, Snowy Bowl because of whatever factors I discuss with my partners. And if I see things I don't like shooting collapse, audible or collapsing, for example, I am free to close terrain in the field. I am not free to open it. And that's how I approach things. So things like obvious signs of instability, more snow than was forecast, more wind drifting than I expected, any of those factors could cause me to back off stuff. And I really encourage people to have enough bravery to back off and turn around. You can have tons of fun on low angle slopes and you're way better coming back a different day.
Awesome. Um, yeah, and a little pitch, if you take an ARI 1 course, you'll get some practice actually communicating with your group about that. As Brian said, it's a lot. It can require some bravery, right? It can be a lot tougher to close terrain and feel like you are changing the course of the day. That can be a lot harder than just going through with the plan sometimes. Um, all right, and then last question that I think we have time for tonight is this person wonders, what are the merits of doing your own snowpack tests, tracking weather throughout the season, et cetera, versus just relying on ones done by avalanche professionals? So what's the merit of getting out there and digging around in the snow yourself?
Well, I think some of that depends on what you're bringing to the table. So, like for one, if this is new to you, like going out and doing your own snowpack tests are like crucial to learning. The only way snowpack tests start to become useful is when you've done tons of them, because like they become useful not because I got 14 whacks from my elbow. Like that stuff doesn't matter. At the end of the day, we're going out and we're digging blocks of snow out of the snowpack and pulling and whacking on them. Like, so what makes these things meaningful is over the course of years and doing hundreds and thousands of them. And then you can start to be like, wow, that's more reactive than I've ever seen. And so being able to build a base of observations helps you put any particular snowpack test into a much larger context. And so when you're new at this game, and you don't have a ton of that, you can gather all the information, read what the forecasters are telling you, go out there and try to find what they're talking about. They're talking about a weak layer that's buried 40 centimeters down on north facing terrain. Go see if you can find it. And then if they're talking about they're very easy to trigger, do your snowpack test. So go out and dig, try to match what you're finding in the field to the forecast. And that's a really good way to help build that foundation of observations so that when you get further down the road and you've been doing this for years, you've got whatever snowpack test you do next, you've got 1,000 to compare it to. And that makes it way more valuable than if it's your second time doing it.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. Okay, with that, we're going to start to wrap up here. We have more questions, and like I said, we're going to work to answer some of those in future ARI newsletters, and there's a couple more good ones in there that I'll have to pick Brian's brain about so we can get an answer from a forecaster. In the meantime, just want to tell you a little bit more about what we've got going on. I'm dropping a link in the chat right now. You probably have already been there at least once to register for this, but there are a bunch more webinars coming up this season, including there will be some more where we'll actually be taking some of what Brian's talking about here and incorporating that into trip planning. So we'll look at a couple different mapping apps and how you might use those to plan your trip into the backcountry, or to have a catalog of potential routes that you might use in the backcountry. And then depending on what's in the forecast and what the avalanche problem is, we'll talk a little about how to incorporate those into your day and determine what's going to be the right fit for you. And then I'm just going to share my screen one more time. Just want to say thanks again to Brian for being here tonight. Really excited to have you here and have your expertise on this, Brian. This was awesome. And thanks also to our sponsor, Onyx Backcountry, made possible to have this free webinar for ARI folks based on Onyx's sponsorship. So we appreciate that. And then a quick shameless nonprofit plug. ARI is a nonprofit organization, and so are the Friends of CAIC. They're the nonprofit friends group that supports the Colorado Avalanche Information Center. We are both nonprofits, and today, if you live in Colorado, you probably know today is Colorado Gives Day. And if you don't live in Colorado, it's a nonprofit giving day, and there's a huge match incentive fund. So all nonprofits in Colorado that I know of are looking to get a little piece of that match fund today to do the important work that we're doing. These QR codes will take you directly to the giving pages for both ARI and the Friends of CAIC. And then it looks like Whitney just dropped our link into the chat as well. So this is the end of the year for us. So every little bit helps as we plan our important work to continue for next year, both us and the Friends of CAIC. Yeah, I'll leave those links up until we end the webinar here in just a few minutes, so folks can scan them if you feel moved to do so. But either way, we really appreciate you joining us, appreciate your support. Brian, so glad to have you here, and thanks again for making the time to tell us a little bit about interpreting those forecasts, Brian.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I'll hang out here for a few minutes.